Hello to all of Beyond Law podcast listeners. Today we're going to record our first episode in English. Our topic today is the basics of international law. And for that, we are hosting an international lawyer who works in an international law firm with a lot of experience. Today we're hosting Mr.Jehad Mustafa, who's working with Volterra. It's a UK law firm, and I will let him introduce himself more and introduce the topic and also Volterra law firm. Hello, Mr. Jehad. I'm really happy to host you today.
Thank you, Abdul Rahman. It's an honor to be talking to you today, and it's also an honor to be on your first ever English podcast where we're making Beyond Law history, and I'm very proud to be involved in that. Thank you. So yes, I am a public international lawyer at the law firm Volterra. Just to tell you about the firm, I'm very lucky to be there. It's the largest specialist public international law firm in the world. We are very lucky to be involved in some of the cutting edge cases in that area of law, including cases before the International Courts of Justice, various state immunity cases, and various multi-billion-dollar arbitrations. That's the kind of work that the firm does. Personally, I am a barrister by training. In England, we have a split legal profession where attorneys are split into barristers and solicitors. And the idea being the solicitor is more of a general lawyer, and barristers are like surgeons. They're the ones with a focus in particular areas. And they're also the ones who historically do the talking in court, who get up in front of the judges. And I'm sure many of your listeners will have seen on television maybe the English lawyers wearing the white horsehair wigs that are very old-fashioned and make you look ridiculous, but that's what we wear. We don't wear it every day, obviously. I'm not wearing one now, but we do tend to wear those when we appear in court. So that's a little bit about me and my firm.
Great. And let's get into the topic. Let's talk about the history of international law. And I really have a weird question here, but the stupid question is that the question that you don't ask. So, is international law really a law?
Well, that is a very good question, if I may say that. Well, yes, I'd say it most certainly is, but it's not really like any other area of law. So normally, a law is linked to a country. So I'm in England at the moment. It's governed by the laws of England and Wales, and the Parliament sets those laws. But the question is, what happens when two countries enter into an arrangement? So let's say England and France, as has happened many times before, enter into a treaty. That is effectively a contract between states. But the question becomes, given that this contract happens on the international plane, what law governs it? Because it cannot be English law and it cannot be French law. There has to be some other legal framework that governs it. And that's where public international law comes in. It governs the relationships between nations. And as I'm sure we'll discuss in due course, that is fundamentally important in making the world operate, because we live in a globalized world where countries work together, they're in alliances, they're in trade agreements, and those relationships have to be regulated and governed, and that's what public international law does. And Abdul Rahman, in England, there's an expression that good fences make good neighbours, and public international law is really quite key in ensuring that those fences are there, that they work together, and the neighbours can work together. So yes, it is a law. And the other thing that's a little bit strange about it is the source of public international law, because normally laws come from governments and legislatures, and obviously there's no world government, there's no world legislature. So what are the sources of public international law? Well, really, there are two main ones. And the first one of those is treaties. So there are many, many treaties that govern the relationships between states. So, for example, there are Vienna Conventions on diplomatic relations, and they govern the rules that apply to diplomats and embassies around the world. And that is one of the sources of law. The other source is customary international law, and that is the habits and regulations that have grown up over many centuries when countries have learned how to make the systems operate. And that is another key source of law. There are some secondary sources of law. For example, there is a court of the United Nations called the International Court of Justice, and they issue decisions on certain cases where they have jurisdiction, and those decisions have persuasive effect, but they're not binding in the way that many legal decisions are, for example, of the Supreme Court in the United Kingdom or the United States. So to answer your question again, Rahman, yes, public international law is very much a law, but it's not like a law that you may know.
Yeah, that's great. That's really insightful information, Mr. Jehad. And I have another question. And let's say also, what are the differences between public international law and private international law?
Well, another very good question. So public international law regulates the relationships between states primarily. Now, individuals obviously are components of states, and within that, their input is significant. But primarily, public international law is about state-to-state relations. Private international law, on the other hand, is just that. It relates to private individuals and relates to their transboundary issues. So, for example, if you've got an award in one country, if you've got an award in Britain and you want to enforce it in France, then that's private international law. Public international law is done on the state-to-state plane. Now, there are examples of when within public international law, the state gives its powers to individuals and companies. Probably the most important example of that, which I think everyone should be aware of because it's a really growing area of law, is investment treaty arbitrations. So, would you like to hear about those now? Is that something that would?
Sure. Yes. You can proceed.
All right. So let's just say that to use the UK France example again, I want to open up a business in France. So I go over to France and I set up a factory or something like that. But then there's a problem in France and the French government take away that factory, and I find that's really unfair. Well, my options in those circumstances are often quite limited. I can either go to the French courts and try and get the courts to order that my factory comes back to me, but the French courts might support the French government and they might not give me a fair opportunity. So that will make me really annoyed. So in those circumstances, I'll have to go and speak to my government, the UK government, and say to them what's happened. And in those circumstances, my government normally has an obligation to go to France and to tell the French government that France owes me duties in public international law, and as a result should give me compensation. The problem is that often governments don't like to have arguments with other governments. It's not good for relations. And why would the UK government try and damage their relations with France just to try and help me? It doesn't make sense. But at the same time, the UK and the French governments want to encourage trade between each other. So what they decide to do is give their powers to companies and individuals by entering into what's called a bilateral investment treaty. So in those circumstances, the United Kingdom says our rights in public international law to challenge the French government, we give to you, Mr. Mustafa, and you can now take France to arbitration in front of a tribunal and enforce your rights there. So that's a really important area in public international law where actually individuals do have rights, but those rights are derived from the rights of the state.
Wonderful. That's great. And I think that will lead me to another question. And it's really interesting working in an international law firm. So how it looks like working in an international law firm?
You know what? It's great. I really love it. It's exciting. It's interesting. There's lots of travel and you meet really interesting, open-minded people. I mean, just to give you an example, at Voltaire Fietta, we have over 30 lawyers here that are specialists in public international law. Just two of them, me and one other lawyer, are from the UK. Everybody else is from all around the world. We have people from Latin America, from the Middle East, from the United States, from Australia. It's a real melting pot of cultures. And the area of public international law, I think, draws people who are naturally curious about politics and international relations, and naturally interested in different cultures and different parts of the globe. People who like to travel, people who like to explore and go on adventures and learn about different nations. So in terms of an area of law, it's a really wonderful, intellectually vibrant area where people from all around the world meet and actually, you know, it's really at the cutting edge of legal thought, because it is such a developing area, because there is still so much uncertainty about it. It's also exciting in the sense that it has a kind of frontier spirit where people do think that many things are still undecided, many things are still possible, and there's a real opportunity for meaningful change and to be part of that. And that's an amazing thing. And these cases, they go down in history. You know, there are cases in the international courts of justice that decide borders, that decide where oceans, where states have rights in oceans, and really fundamental issues that will last for hundreds, if not thousands of years. So it's a fascinating area, and one that I very much recommend people looking to explore their options in a legal career.
Great. Let's say, and I think this question is probably in every fresh graduate mind. So if I want to join an international law firm, what are the steps to excel in working in this field? Well,
it's not easy, but as the principal of the firm here would very much say, you know, if it's worth having, it doesn't come easy. So first, obviously, you've got to get a grounding in academia. I think virtually everyone at Voltaire Fietta not only has obviously an undergraduate degree, but most have a postgraduate degree in some form of international law. So that's certainly a help. There are two other areas which I think can help you excel. Well, three areas, I suppose. I mean, first, obviously, like any area of law, a hard-working attitude, a focused and dedicated attitude is absolutely essential. You know, law is a very competitive area full of very able people. If you're not going to be dedicated, you're not going to get anywhere. So that's a key start. Then after that, it's very necessary to get good practical experience. Now, it's often the case, myself included, that people come into international law having first worked in domestic litigation or worked in another field of law, and that can be really helpful. So my grounding was in commercial litigation with some criminal law, and that gave me certain skills, for example, advocacy skills, conducting cross-examination, and a certain rigor that comes through a domestic litigation system, and that's been really useful in international law. So that's definitely something I would suggest, practical experience. And the third area is so important that I've forgotten it. I'm sure it'll come back to me. But yeah, I think those are the key areas.
So let's ask some personal questions for you, Mr. Jehad. What are the obstacles you're facing in working international law firm?
Well, the principal obstacle is that is such a wonderful field that really there are so many people that want to enter it and work in it that access to working in this particular area of law can be quite challenging. I'm incredibly fortunate to be at the leading international law firm. I realise that's not obviously an option that's open to everyone. All I can say is there are other firms out there who obviously are engaged in international law, but there are also many government institutions that have fantastic public international law departments across the Gulf. So, for example, we work closely with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Saudi Arabia, and they have fantastic public international lawyers. So there are various career routes into working in this area of law that don't just involve private practice. So that was probably the key obstacle.
Great. So going back to the fresh graduate situation, so do and don'ts if you're working in international law firm. Do be open-minded, do be sensitive to cultures and non-judgmental. One of the wonderful things about working in the area is you get to travel and meet different people and see different cultures. And there are certain people, particularly in Western countries, who may take in a judgmental approach. But when you actually arrive in those countries around the world, you see that they operate in ways that are completely successful and legitimate. So avoiding any kind of judgmental attitude, having an open attitude, being sensitive to the needs of your clients are key aspects. And yeah, the opposite applies. Don't be closed-minded, and don't enter the field if you are going to have preconceptions about the way things should be done. Because it's such an evolving area, I think a creative attitude and a creative spirit is important. And because you're working, it's so important that teamwork is prioritized in order to be successful for your clients. I think you've got to have a positive attitude that you're going to work well with your colleagues. So they're my main suggestions. Great. I think you've heard about the three international law firms the Minister of Justice, Dr. Walid al-Samani, have given their licenses. So what do you think about that? And when we will see Voltaire Fietta inside it?
Well, we're very lucky at Voltaire Fietta to have very good working relationships with many of the Gulf states. We spend a lot of time in Saudi Arabia, and I have many good friends in Riyadh and across the Middle East. And, I was in Riyadh recently, and it's astonishing what's happening in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. The ambition, the scope, the determination is incredible. And the attitude is much like public international law. There's a frontier spirit, there's a creative desire to change things, and there's a real feeling that anything is possible. And that's wonderful to see. And it's also wonderful to see that kind of attitude permeating into different areas. And obviously one area is the professional services field. And anything that encourages the legal profession in Saudi Arabia to flourish is certainly a good thing. And those are three fantastic firms, there's no doubt about it. We at Voltaire Fietta are keeping a very close eye on the situation. It's certainly something we would be delighted to be involved in if the opportunity presents itself. And being part of being in Saudi Arabia as it continues to flourish would be something quite special, I think.
Great. I would really thank you, Mr. Jehad, for this insightful information and insightful talks. So last recommendations, or if you have anything you want to say?
You know what, Abdurrahman, I think obviously you ask the questions and you're very good at it, but I think it's about time you give some answers. So I've got a question for you. Okay, it's a quiz question. It shows you just how important public international law is. Okay, can you name a state in the Middle East that has another state completely within its borders?
In the Middle East.
In the Gulf, in fact, in the Gulf. It's a country
really tricky.
that has a part of another country completely within its borders.
Wait, I don't think it's UAE, and I don't think it's Kuwait. I don't think Qatar. No. Qatar has different. But I would say Bahrain.
Okay.
I would say Bahrain because of the bridge between Saudi and Bahrain.
That's a good guess. It's not correct. You've actually given the correct answer so far. But do you want me to help you?
Yeah, sure.
So, within the UAE is an enclave called Mahda.
Okay.
I've never been. Have you been? Have you heard of it?
I've heard of it, but I didn't think that.
So if you look at a map of the UAE and you type in Mahda, you see that near the coast, the east coast is an enclave, so a complete part of Oman that is within the UAE. And you know what's stranger than that? Within Mahda, so within the part of Oman that's within the part of the UAE, there is a place called Nahwa. And Nahwa is part of the UAE within Oman, within the UAE.
I think it figured that because Oman doesn't have any Gulf coast, so I think UAE has given them this land, so they have this coast, and they would be barred from the Gulf.
Oh, is that right? Okay,
yeah.
Well, that is You know what's interesting about this is this is a classic example of public international law in action. So when Oman and UAE were discussing their borders and their territorial areas, they did something fantastic. Actually, they asked the local populations which country they wanted to be a part in. They gave them that choice. And the people of Mahda, for whatever reason, felt more part of Oman. And the UAE said, of course, and that's as you're right, and they gave them the land. But the people of Nahwa, notwithstanding the fact that he was in Mahda, wanted to be part of UAE, and Oman said, yes, that's your right, and they allowed them that. And that was all thanks to public international law. So that's what public international law does. It allows good neighbours to be good friends, and that's a classic example of it.
That's really new information to me, to be honest. And I'm shocked because I'm living in the Gulf and I studied in UAE, and I don't know this. So thank you.
But actually, the bridge is another example. The bridge between Saudi Arabia and Bahrain, because that is a border that was created where there was no border before. So obviously, Bahrain was an island and completely separate. And when the bridge was built, an island was built in between Bahrain and Saudi Arabia. I've not been there. I'm sure you have been there, and you've seen
been there.
Yeah. So what happened to that border and who belonged to it and how it functioned was purely a creation of public international law. So every time you cross that bridge, or your listeners cross that bridge, I want them to think of public international law and be thankful that the reason you have this fantastic causeway between the two countries is some lawyers sitting somewhere discussing a treaty so that it can work.
That's really wonderful, to be honest. I think there's many examples around the world about this situation, but 2 examples in the Gulf region, that's a lot.
No, absolutely. I'd say I think the Gulf at the moment is at the forefront of this area of law, so maybe there'll be some more soon.
Great. So at the end, if you have anything to say, Mr. Jehad, and I would really thank you for your time that you're giving for Beyond Law podcast. And I know you're a very busy man, and I've been trying to record this podcast maybe 2 months ago, and we had the chance now. So really appreciate your time. I really appreciate your insightful information. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And thank you to your listeners. It's been an absolute pleasure to join you today. And I hope to see the next generation of international lawyers coming onto the scene very soon.